Hi, this is Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 97 of That's a Good Question. How should Christians view the January 6th investigation? This week, the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on our nation's capital met for the 8th and final scheduled, and I say scheduled because it appears that this may not be their last meeting. Some new information's come to light, and they may meet in September some more. And at least 2 of the 8 hearings that we've seen them have been televised in primetime slots. And that was the case with this week's hearing. And every network was carrying these hearings in their primetime viewing, except for one. It was not on Fox Network.
Let me guess. Okay.
Yeah. The one that probably the audience most needs to see it.
Yeah.
But much of the country did get to see these, and unfortunately, as I said, probably not the part of the country that most needs it. But we have been encouraging you and our audience to diversify your sources.
Yeah.
And so it's our hope that you were able to see at least portions of these. I was joking with Pastor Ken, I can't really watch the whole things because I get somewhat agitated and they're kind of stressful for me to learn the new facts that are coming out. And so I just kind of try to catch the highlights, but again, not going to just one source to get those.
Right.
So hopefully that recommendation we've been making is having good effect. But so first, let's be clear about why we 2 pastors are here talking about this. And it is because we think that it's important from a pastoral mission standpoint. We are repeatedly speaking of when we talk about political topics, the reason behind it is not because we are interested in politics, very specifically not me interested in politics. I know you find them somewhat interesting, but you don't think, you wouldn't be...
That would be our purpose here.
Yeah, you wouldn't be using pastoral time to do that just because of your it's a hobby of yours.
Right.
Rather, we're concerned about the effects that these things have on what we're called to do as Christians. And so in following, Paul's command in 1 Timothy 2, where he says, pray for kings and all in authority, we recognize the reason that he gives that command. He says that so that we may live peaceful and quiet lives. And then he goes on to tie that into our mission, and that's what we're talking about here. It's our mission of evangelism and witness, because he says, God, our Savior, wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth.
Right.
So you and I look at these events and what's going on as, this attempted disruption of our governmental process, a process we've been very blessed to live under in our country. And it concerns us as citizens, but more importantly, it concerns us as Christians because it can have an effect on our mission, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about it, biblically, orderliness and predictability are the friend of planning and carrying out ministry. Historians have long observed that the spread of Christianity benefited from what is called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And that was developed because of the power and the structure and the relative calm that the power of Rome produced. The truth is, no one messed with Rome. So Christian evangelists could travel without running into coup attempts and insurrections. If you were a Roman citizen, as the Apostle Paul was, you had rights to which you could appeal. And there was an orderly process for adjudicating your issues. Paul did that several times, as recorded in the book of Acts. He didn't, I'm sure, like those who were in charge, but he cared less about their politics and their demeanor than he did their actions.
Very strategic of him.
Exactly.
Right? Mission strategic.
Mission.
Yeah.
That's right. And what he cared about was whether the actions of those who were in authority were just and whether they allowed him to pursue his calling. So that's what we care about. And as we've seen in prior episodes, when orderliness is threatened, when our institutions are destabilized, it makes our work more difficult. The mission will move forward, of course, no matter what. But we prefer, as Paul did, that we do so in an environment that's conducive to the rule of law and the administration of justice.
I just noticed a distinction there in what the way you said that and the way we often warn against, because folks who may take a different approach that we've been somewhat critical of will also cite mission connectedness. This is going to stop the mission. But you didn't say that. You didn't say it's going to. You didn't encourage us to now take a posture of fear.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
The mission's going to go on,
right.
but we're doing what the Bible calls us to do in praying for strategic benefits.
That's right.
Yeah.
We prefer it this way for ministry purposes.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And so we're conservative. We want to conserve, not destroy those very institutions that we're talking about, including the electoral process and the bodies that make it possible at the local, the state, and the national levels. It's been a marvel here in America for the rest of the world that we've been able to elect a head of state every 4 years and then have a peaceful transfer of power every single time for over 200 years, except one. Just think about that. In our lifetime, we have had the unhappy circumstance of being the single exception to that beautiful record. I hope it's the last one in our lifetime, but we will see. So if you support an attack on the Capitol, as believe it or not, some do, or if you just dismiss it as no big deal, as many more do, then please know you can't at the same time claim the moniker conservative while you support the destruction of what we need to conserve, or you turn a blind eye when it's attempted. So Christians should view the attack and attempted subversion of our electoral process very, very, very seriously, as it does not bode well for that peace and quiet that 1 Timothy 2 talks about for our mission if, in fact, those things are destroyed.
Yeah. So most people know to what we refer when we simply say January 6th. We talk about this as a date that will live in our memories because of the unprecedented nature of what occurred that day. But also because the president, when he finally did come out and ask for his followers to go home about 3 hours or so after, as we've been hearing in these hearings, after the attack started, he said, "Remember this day forever."
Yeah.
So when the 1-year anniversary of the attack came around and was remembered by most media outlets this year, we heard people disparaging it, saying, that's in the past. What's the big deal? But, the former president himself said it should be remembered forever.
That's right.
And, we know that he was saying this because he was approving of the people that did this heinous thing. But he told them, and to support what I'm saying here, I'm just not just anti-Trump.
Yeah.
He said things like, "We love you, and you're very special to us." But we also need to deal with it. The reason these hearings are important, 18 months after the attack, is because accountability and justice need to be meted out. So that hopefully it won't happen again. And that's, I told you I don't watch the hearings live for the most part just because, there's a lot. I kind of want to hear it boiled down, and I want to be able to sort through without getting overly frustrated with all that's happened and the folks that let it happen. But most people know what happened that day, at least in general terms, but I was clueless about some of these details the committee has brought to light, the kind of actions that were taken before, during, and after. And it's been amazing to me how meticulous in detail they've been. And I think it helps even the most avid naysayer of how big of a deal this is. It's hard to argue against those details. So let's talk about how this committee came to be, and then some of what they found.
Well, in the white hot heat of the moment, after Congress and our vice president are sent scrambling for safety, and they came within seconds, literally seconds, of being confronted by the mob, and then who knows what happens. If they get a hold of Mike Pence, after the president's put out a tweet saying he didn't have the courage to do what had to be done, right in the middle of this, the anger. They get a hold of Nancy Pelosi after they've been taught to hate her, not just oppose her, hate her and others. So they're within seconds of being confronted by the mob. At that point, everyone's united for those several hours when people's hearts, I can imagine the Congress people, their hearts are pounding, blood pressure is rising as the fear is growing, and they are whisked away to some area for safety. Those congressmen and women, senators, they frantically sought help from the president or his aides or his cabinet. And those watching on television, horrified at what they were seeing, they texted everyone whose number they had in their contacts, get a message to the president, stop this now, tell them to go home now. That came from politicians, but also from the president's own family. Ivanka and Donald Trump, the committee has shown the texts from them, sending to Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, tell him to do this now. And from some of the president's favorite media personalities, Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham, and from former staffers of his, all of them with this same message: stop this now. Tell them to go home. Condemn the violence. And this week's hearing documented the multiple and frantic attempts to get the president to act. Now notice that these contacts are asking him, President Trump, to tell the rioters to go home. And that puts the lie to the claim that this was a false flag in the form of Antifa. I mean, that immediately started to circulate, as you may recall. And in fact,
as we've noted by some people who knew it wasn't. That's in the media.
Well, the president, some in the media, I just learned this last night. Either I forgot it, but I don't think I ever knew it. That when he spoke on January 6th, in the heat of the moment, to the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy. He speaks to him on the phone. And this is this famous conversation they have where Kevin says, you got to do something. And Trump says, well, Kevin, I guess these people care more about the election outcome than you do. Okay, but I knew that. But he said in that conversation, Trump did, at first he said, Kevin, those are Antifa. Trump said that. Well, he knew full well that they weren't Antifa. He had just spoken to them. And Kevin goes, no, they're your supporters. You've got to stop them. And then Trump switched on a dime and says, well, I guess they care more about it. So he throws this Antifa thing out there. Yeah. And then that started to circulate among some of his favorite media people as well. So for a while, there was this idea that it was a false flag. Some people still believe that to this day. Or it was the FBI. There's this guy, this poor guy, his name is Ray Epps. If you were to Google poor Ray Epps, there was a story about him, a long story about him, picture of him and his wife outside like their Winnebago, their RV, because they've had to go to an undisclosed location to hide because people want to kill him because they're convinced he's with the FBI. And he's this big Trump supporter who got himself in the middle of this on January 6th. He was there, and they've put a bunch of things together to create this rumor that this Ray Epps guy was an FBI agent, and it was the FBI who was sending people in there. And the guys had to quit his job. They had to sell their business. They had to get out of the state that they lived in, go to another state.
Wow.
In the days after the attack, the leading Republicans in both the House and the Senate, I mentioned Kevin McCarthy, he's the minority leader in the House. You got Mitch McConnell, the minority leader in the Senate. They condemned the attack. And Trump specifically, they condemned for starting it. But soon after that, they backed off condemning Trump. In fact, McCarthy made what can only be called a pathetic pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago several days later for this unity photo op with Trump. And since then, he said nary a word in condemnation. When the move to form a committee, now, why did they do that, by the way? Their polls were showing. I'll talk about this in a little bit.
It seems like a kiss the ring move.
That's what it was. That's exactly what it was. And then there was a move then to form a committee to investigate. And when that began, almost immediately, you saw how far McCarthy and then to a lesser extent, McConnell had fallen. These polls showed that Republican primary base voters were in favor. And they think the election was stolen. And that could make the difference between the Republicans being able to, this November, take the House and the Senate back. So when I say the primary base voters, what are we talking about? Well, as most of you know, before a November election like we're going to have this year, you have primaries. We're going to have in just a few weeks in August around the country. And so people are running in the primaries to be the Republican candidate for governor or for Senate or for the House. And you're seeing all the commercials right now here in Michigan, and I'm sure I know in other states. So that's what I mean by the primary. Well, who votes in the primaries? Unfortunately, not very many people. Not enough people vote in the general election. You get about half of the eligible electorate actually votes in a general election in November. And even in a presidential November year, only about half. But you get way less than that. You get something like 15 or 20% voting in the primary. Well, those are the really motivated people. And when I say motivated, let me use another word. Sometimes the crazy, the crazy people. And so that is how you can get someone winning primaries that doesn't have a chance to win in the general election, usually. I mean, forgive me, I don't mean to call this person crazy. I don't think he is crazy. But you take someone who's just a complete long shot, no hope candidate like Bernie Sanders. You know, we've had a couple of presidential election cycles where Bernie kind of is out there and he's getting all the support in the primaries and he's winning, but that's because you've got, people that are the most motivated voting for him. But if he were to ever break through and actually get the nomination, he would get killed in the general election. So a primary problem, what I mean by the primary problem is the primaries. And you get these extreme elements. Remember 2010 is when the Tea Party really got going. And the Tea Party put forward all of these candidates, and frankly, they were out there kinds of candidates. And all of them lost. They all lost in the general election. They got through the primary, but then they lose in the general election. And they were all Republicans, by the way. So a guy like me, I can remember that. And I'm like, who are these people? Why are they getting the... But I had a sigh of relief when they didn't win in the general election. What I didn't think about, and I should have, is, well, okay, that's going to be back. That's not just a one-year thing. And not only is it back, it's now becoming more mainstream. The Overton window has moved to now include this kind of craziness, so that now some of those people are going to get through, and some of those people
are in office.
They're already in there now.
Yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, those kinds of people. Yeah. So they may win. Some are already in, as you say. Though, here's the good news. There are some signs that people have had about enough of the crazy, at least for now. I hope that that'll continue. But here was the first proposal to investigate what happened on January 6th. It was to be a bipartisan committee outside of Congress. So this would be a blue ribbon kind of panel to look into it. So we've had a number of those over the years. Probably the most famous one was the 9/11 committee. That was a bipartisan, and what it meant was you had an even number of people, Republican and Democrat, chosen, I should say, by their leaders in Congress that are Republican and Democrat. So they each get to choose 8, let's say. You're going to have a 16-member, panel. So you have an even number. All can call for subpoenas. All can call for witnesses to come and recommend who should be subpoenaed. That was the first thing. Seems logical to me.
Right.
Take it out of the realm of politics. Okay. McConnell in the Senate says no. Now, why? My guess is because he's thinking about the primaries the next year. He's thinking about the primaries now this year that are coming up, and he doesn't want to get harmed by the crazies for his party and not regain the Senate, which he has a very good chance of doing in November. So remember this then. The Republicans were offered a completely bipartisan and equal committee outside Congress, and they are the ones who rejected it. So then Nancy Pelosi said, now as the Speaker of the House, she's going to use her majority to form a committee in the House, not the Senate. But now it's going to be unequal numbers and unequal power. And I think it's, 8 and 5 is what she proposed, something like that. And so there are more Democrats than Republicans. Still, the Republicans were invited to give 5 names. McCarthy gave 5 names, but of 2 of those names were Jim Jordan and Jim Banks. Here's the problem with them. They're both implicated in the riot itself. So she accepts the other 3. She told him choose 2 more. Instead, he pulled all of them, and he appointed no one. Pelosi found 2 Republicans with the courage to serve. We know now, most people know Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. Cheney's the co-chair of the committee, and she at least, if not both of them, have become a star for many people, an example of someone who's willing to risk losing her seat in Congress. And she's up in her primary race in August in Wyoming, and she's never had any worries about getting reelected. Cheney's a big name.
Her family's an institution.
And she might lose, but she doesn't care.
And to some candidates that I can't believe are actually running for an office.
I know, they're horrible.
Yeah.
So hopefully, we'll see. Hopefully Wyoming will come to their senses. But in her view, this is a test for our very government, and literally whether it will in the future be what we've known in the past. And so we'll discuss today a bit of how close we came to losing our government structure as we've known it. But let me just throw in one other thing. So Kevin McCarthy decides, that's fine. We're just not going to play at all. And here this committee has had really actually quite high ratings. Polls have shown it's actually had some effect on people's view of Trump and whether or not he should run again, that kind of thing. And Trump, this is so funny. I mean, here's Kevin going and kissing the ring, right? Like you said. And what does Trump do? He says McCarthy's an idiot for not putting people on this committee. So he's criticizing Kevin when all the while Kevin's trying to ingratiate himself to Trump.
Yeah, it is. It's very sad actually to watch.
Sad.
It's kind of a circus. Yeah. I don't hope for the sake of my party. I don't want to see conservative party, Republican Party damaged, but it seems like it's almost damaged beyond repair at some points in this. Yeah. But I really think a lot of the folks who caved to that are going to look really horrible on the other side of this because it's having some effect, like you said.
Yeah, I can't quote what Liz Cheney said, but it's a classic when she said to my Republican colleagues that history will remember your lack of honor.
Yeah.
And I think
that was very powerful when she said that. I don't know that I agree with her on all of her positions. Many of them I do, but man, the courage and example has been inspiring. Yeah. So we've had this committee and its investigation now for months, and they've interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They've issued dozens of subpoenas. And then finally, several weeks ago, they started having these public hearings so we could see what they found. So let's talk about that. What have they found?
Well, they found that the strategy of the Trump people was multifaceted and that it started before the election. Trump was down in the polls, if you remember, in most polls in 2020, because, COVID and his handling of COVID, frankly, really killed him. I think his mishandling of COVID is what cost him the election.
Almost like he was working against himself.
It really was. Yeah. So in most polls, he was down. Just like in 2016, it looks like he's going to lose. So he did the same thing as he did in 16. Before the election, he said if he loses, it was rigged. Now, remember, as we've said in the past, Trump has claimed fraud in every election he's lost and preemptively done so, even when he's won, like he did in 2016. But he kept saying, that it's rigged if I lose. But then he won. He lost his very first contest ever as a politician in early 2016 in the Iowa caucuses, their version of a primary. He lost to Ted Cruz. He immediately claims, without any proof, of course, that Cruz cheated. Then when he won the nomination, but was behind in 2016 in all the polls during the campaign, he repeatedly says that Clinton was going to steal the election and that it was rigged, until, of course, he won, and then the election system apparently works fairly well. And then in 2020, he's planning the same, but worse, because now he has the levers of power to do more. So a guy named Steve Bannon said that's what Trump was going to do just 4 days before the 2020 election. So who is Steve Bannon? Just to remind us of the quality of people that Trump chose to surround himself with, he had to fire Bannon as his senior advisor in the White House in 2017. So in August of 2017, you're only 8 months into a new administration. He has to fire Bannon. Bannon had said these negative things about Trump and about his family. Donald Trump Jr. had been treasonous, he said, by meeting with a Russian attorney. That was the whole Russia collusion thing. By the way, he was right about that. And he labeled Ivanka Trump as, quote, dumb as a brick. Those statements drove Trump to issue a lengthy statement saying that he had, quote, lost his mind and, quote, Steve Bannon has nothing to do with me or my presidency. Trump says that at the time. Now, you figure you're never going to hear of Trump and Bannon together again after that, right? Well, lo and behold, he pops up, Bannon does, again in the summer of 2020 during the election campaign. He's offering advice before the election, and he's pushing his false theories after Trump ends up losing.
Apparently, he's a good salesman.
Yes.
So why did Trump let him back in? Is it salesmanship in his circle after he said all these negative things about him?
Look, I don't know, but that's not knowing has never kept me from commenting. So I don't know, but I know this. Bannon was probably going to jail at the time because he was charged with crimes for which there was overwhelming evidence, and Trump could be of help to him with that. So what was it that Bannon did? He stole money from MAGA supporters. This just, by the way, shows the real contempt that these guys have for their own people. Okay, MAGA supporters, had given millions to an entity that Bannon ran that was called Build the Wall.
Wait, so he's ready. I thought Mexico was paying for the wall.
Yeah, so thanks for the reminder. And remember that? Yeah. During the 26th, and at the campaign rallies, and who's going to pay for it? And everybody yells back, Mexico. Yeah, okay. It turns out Bannon used at least $1 million of that money for personal expenses. And every penny was supposed to go to build the wall between the U.S. and Mexico. But he was pardoned by Trump. On the last day, Trump's last day in office, January 20 of 2021, he's pardoned. Steve Bannon is pardoned, so the charges against Bannon had to be dropped. So why did they get back together? Why did Trump let him back into his good graces? I don't know, but one could be forgiven for concluding that Bannon's services with the false election claims and pushing the narrative are what got him a pardon, that they were both of help to each other at that time. In any case, get this. Bannon was secretly recorded, and you can Google the recording, on Halloween, October 31 of 2020, saying what Trump is going to do if he loses. 4 days before the election in 2020, he's saying, and you can listen to he said that because the Democrats do more mail-in ballots and those get counted later in some crucial states, then Trump will be ahead in those crucial states on the night of the election. And he's just going to declare victory before the people and go to bed. And then when these other votes come in, if he's behind, he's going to claim fraud. So his followers, and I've heard this testimony directly from lots of people who were really concerned that there was widespread fraud in the election because they watched the returns come in, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 11:30. Trump's ahead. They go to bed. Trump's going to be the president. In the morning, they wake up and he's behind. What happened in between? And that's where you get now all the conspiracies about truckloads of ballots coming in and all of that stuff. It's none of that. It's because of this, how you count and who has more of that type of ballot, Democrat or Republican. Yeah. And they knew this ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he says, we're going to do that. So that all sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because that, in fact, is what they did.
Yeah, and that's in. They said it's going to happen. That's exactly what happened. And there's the narrative.
Here we are. So they said they were going to manufacture a crisis, and they did, just as Bannon predicted to a T. But Bannon also predicted what would happen on January 6th. On the day before January 6th, on January 5th, he said, all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. Just understand this. All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. It's going to be moving. It's going to be quick. He says, so many people said, man, if I was in the revolution, I'd be in Washington. Well, this is your time in history. It's all converging, and now we're on the point of attack tomorrow. And all I can say is strap in. You have made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day.
Yeah. So why hasn't he been brought before the January 6th committee then? Can we talk about that?
Oh, well, yeah. And he was in court this week about that very thing. He was, in fact, subpoenaed by the committee. He defied it, claiming executive privilege. Now, remember what executive privilege is. The president's the executive. His communications to his underlings are privileged so that he can have frank and open discussions and not worry about those being disclosed and that kind of thing. It's a real and valid thing. Here's the only problem is Bannon hasn't been in government since 2017. So communications with someone about politics and about a re-election effort and that kind of thing are not executive privilege
So the
claims.
president's conversations with you are not protected?
Indeed.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, and I do talk with Trump every now and then as well.
I doubt that.
Well, get this. Bannon was convicted just yesterday for contempt of Congress for this very thing because he defied the subpoena. So I guess he's either going to testify or he's going to go to jail. The problem for him,
Well, he can't avoid going to jail, can he?
well, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Even if he testifies.
Well, maybe if they cut a deal that says, maybe I don't know. I don't know. I'm not an attorney, but the problem for him is he doesn't have Trump to pardon him anymore. And the problem for Trump is Trump can't pardon him anymore.
Yeah.
So he's no longer president, and he cannot buy anybody's silence now with a pardon.
Yeah. And so let's clarify that. Trump has pardoned others who could have testified against him.
Many. Michael Flynn. Flynn gave a deposition sort of to the January 6th committee. Now I say sort of because he wouldn't answer even straightforward questions, just pleading the fifth throughout this.
It would be interesting. I bet you there's a video somewhere with a count every time, like a clock, like a shot or a clock. Ding,
There
ding.
should be.
So remind everybody what the fifth is.
So it refers to the Fifth Amendment, which says you do not have to testify if what you say may incriminate you. Incriminate in crime. Okay, it's saying it implicate you in a crime. That is, if you think what you might say will make it look like you committed a crime, then you can force the prosecutor to prove his case in other ways. You don't have to testify against yourself. Everybody has that right to plead the fifth. Trump said famously one time, the only people who plead the fifth are guilty people. But anyway, so here's a portion of his deposition as he's questioned by none other than Liz Cheney. She says, do you believe the violence on 1/6 was justified? Then there's this 2-minute break for him to consult with his attorney to answer that question. The attorney comes back on screen and then asks her to repeat the question. She does, and the attorney then asks for a clarification. Is that a moral question or a legal question? She says, I'm asking both. And
That's a very lawyer thing to...
And then finally Flynn says, the fifth. She then asks the question separately just to get him on the record. Do you believe the violence on January 6th was justified morally? He says, take the fifth. She says, do you believe the violence on January 6th was justified legally? He says, again, simply fifth. And then she lastly asked, General Flynn, do you believe in the peaceful transition of power in the United States of America? To which he replies, again, the fifth, so that he doesn't incriminate himself.
Wow. How could a person in his position...
Well, at this point, as he's giving that testimony in the last several months to the January 6th committee, he's not in a position at that point, but he was the national security advisor for our country, but he lost his job for lying to the FBI. He was convicted, so Trump pardoned him too. He's been out of government for years now, but in those years he's grown increasingly extreme. He's publicly urged Trump to enact martial law during the lame duck 2 months between the November election in 2020 and then the inauguration in January 21. Or he said he should order a rerun of the election, and he's privately advocated for Trump to seize voting machines in several states when Trump was still president. And he says, quote, I mean, it's not unprecedented. He said on Newsmax, did we say diversify your news sources? Yeah, we did, didn't we?
As you do that, you don't feel obligated to incorporate Newsmax.
This is
I just
true.
want to throw that in there.
I mean, really, it's true. And then he says, these people are out there talking about martial law like it's something that we've never done. I mean, I've been around for my 60 years. I don't quite recall, thankfully. Last year, he told a crowd that there was, quote, no reason a military coup shouldn't take place in the United States.
This is just amazing to me. And then if you don't know all of these things and you see a quote or a little video snippet from a guy with his title and history, you think it's credible. You think you give it some weight. Yeah. So you said the strategy of the Trump camp, was multifaceted and started before the election, and that they included it included this part with Bannon lying or laying out the Freudian slip there.
Yes, exactly.
With Bannon laying out that they would claim it was fraud if he lost. So then he does lose.
Right.
Most of us remember the chaos of the election night and the days that followed that, all the claims of evidence for fraud, but then no actual proof or evidence that's persuasive coming through. Correct. They go through 60 court cases, over 60 court cases, and lose all but one. Right. They have recounts upon recounts in various states, no proof. Right. And then these court cases go on for weeks. They make the news. The attorneys come on, going to release the Kraken.
Yes.
Promise after promise.
Yes.
And false hope because nothing comes through. Yeah. And it's all in hopes that their guy is indeed going to be kept in office.
Yeah, exactly. And so with all of that going on, the mayhem happening over a 2-month period, this committee then has highlighted heroes who stood their ground to protect the process in that avalanche of false claims. Almost all of them were Trump supporters who voted for Trump in these red states, or that he lost very narrowly. That he won in 2016 very narrowly, but now he lost narrowly. But almost all of them were Trump supporters who, in Georgia, in Arizona,
who would have put a stop to it immediately if they found something.
And had an incentive to, one, because it's their job, but two, Trump's their guy.
Might have cost them their office that they didn't.
Yes,
some of them it did.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So they're Trump supporters. They voted for him, but they couldn't go along with the false stop the steal. One example is a guy named Rusty Bowers, and he testified before the January 6th committee. He's the Republican Speaker of the House in Arizona, but he refused to say, as Trump was pressuring him to do, that the election was stolen. But get this, Trump puts out a press release in November of 20 saying that this guy, Rusty Bowers, had told him the election was rigged. And Bowers testified under oath that he said no such thing, and he had no evidence of any such thing. That testimony that he gave before the January 6th committee comes at a cost. Just this past week, this was a busy week, he was censured, can you believe, for telling the truth. The guy was censured by the Arizona Republican Party. You have a state senator in Michigan, in our state of Michigan, who chaired a committee to investigate claims of fraud, because there were a lot of them claimed in Michigan. He found none. He put out he chaired a committee. That committee put out a 63-page paper. He's a Republican. He's a Trump voter and a supporter. Remember all the pressure that was put on Brad Raffensperger, and the January 6th committee has gone into detail with that. And we have that recording as well, and pressure on others. And they stood up at crucial times, refusing to go along with the lie of a stolen election.
Yeah. You commented, and you might be planning to say this at some point in this conversation, but we talked about how this committee is slanted Democrat because, Republicans refuse to participate. Right. But almost every single testimony that we've heard is from a supporter of Trump.
There you go. Yeah.
So you might have Democrats leading the committee, but they're not parading Democrats through, who we all know dislike Trump.
These are people who worked for Trump.
People who were supporters, not only voted for him, but helped him get elected in many cases.
Worked in the White House.
So then to recap, before the election, Bannon's saying they'll create this false narrative, and in fact they do. Right. They stir up the chaos in these various states that are close races. People who see this on the news, they kind of think, well, where there's smoke, there must be fire, right?
Yeah, there must be
so
something
they
wrong.
take that approach since there are questions. People, Republican leaders they trust are asking questions. And so even today, there might be somebody watching still today who thinks the election was stolen, or that there's a chance the election was stolen, but they've been just unable to prove it in the courts, and they've been unable to get these election officials to stand up and, have a spine. And so what's left?
So, let's talk about what's left. But before we do this whole thing about, where there's smoke, there's fire, and people just saying, wow, there's so many questions swirling. There are all these questions. It's amazing how many of these Republican politicians they're asked, hey, was this a legitimate election? And their answer is, there are a lot of questions out there. People have a lot of questions. Right, because you're stirring up the questions.
Right.
With no proof.
Because there really aren't questions.
But now you can say there's questions. We need to get answers to these things that we created the questions for.
Yeah.
Well, I should add to what we've already talked about that also this week, a 75-page report by Republicans, again, who are election experts, a guy named Ben Ginsberg. If you just look up that name, this guy is just amazing. In the 2000 election, remember when that was disputed in Florida? He was a major part of that. The guy just knows inside and out the electoral process, and he helped write this report he's a Republican, other Republicans, and they said there was no fraud in the 2020 election, none that would, in every election you've got a vote or two or five, but, nothing. And in fact, they note, get this, that there's never been an election anywhere that has swung the vote by even 1,000 votes. Anywhere for dog catcher, for anything. You can't, there's never been anything that, so if you have a deficit of 10,000 votes, you lost. Now, in Florida, back in 2000, the presidency hung in the balance on 572 votes. And that went on for something like 35 days in the courts. Remember the hanging chads?
I was going to say, that's exactly what I thought of. It's hard for you to understand if you didn't live through that.
No,
if you're younger,
the little dimples, the little pieces of paper that they're called. We didn't know they were called chads.
We do know
until then. And I thought that it would be fitting because poor Al Gore ends up losing that Bush at least give him an ambassadorship to Chad.
That would have been great.
Anyway, so there's this escalation of attempts to overturn the results of the election, starting with the false claims, then moving to the courts, then to state officials, and then finally you ask what's left. That brings you to January 6th, as that's the day to certify the electoral votes. There's an intense campaign then against who? Pence. Because he is the guy who Trump is told by some people, hey, Pence can refuse to accept these. So now he's tried for weeks, the lie that it was stolen, the courts, the state officials, and now we're down to our last thing, and that last thing happens to be a person in the form of Mike Pence. Now, they got Republican Congress people to go along with it. They're willing to say, hey, in our state, we're going to contest these electors and then, make Pence rule on this. But he stood his ground. He did that with the help. Here's another hero. Retired judge named Michael Ludig. And Ludig is a guy who I remember his name from years ago when Supreme Court vacancies would come up under Republican presidents. His name was always on the short list. Just a hero within conservative legal circles. But Pence reached out to him and he said, no, you do not have the authority to do this. And Pence went along with that. But
so Pence wasn't like, no, I don't want to do this because I dislike Trump. He was like, is this something that's real?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he's having to do this, Pence, because he's getting this pressure, and the pressure is intensified because there are shopping lawyers out there. They find a guy named John Eastman who comes up with this theory that he can do it, and Ludig, shoots that down. Now, think about this. What if the people making the decisions, Raffensperger and, Pence and Ludig and, these other people, what if Rusty Bowers in Arizona, they put MAGA before country? What if that happened? Mark Levin, we said this back in 2021. I mentioned that Levin was floating this idea that the state legislatures on his program on Fox, hey, you guys, you have the right to determine who the electors are going to be. You can reject the electors and send an alternate. So this thing is being promoted on Fox by none other than Mark Levin. And I don't know if you remember this, but we commented on it at the time. I said, think about that. If you've got a Republican legislature and the Republican candidate lost, you can now say we're sending Republican electors anyway as our slate to Washington and overturning the will of the people.
Yeah, effectively nullifying the election you just had.
Exactly. So we came very close. You had a few people in key positions, some of them no-name people that we would have never known anything about, the Raffenspergers and the Rusty Bowers and those people who stood up and said, no, I'm not going to do this. My concern is who's going to be making those decisions in 2024 now that this is, and if Trump runs again and does the it's rigged kind of thing, and he's got millions of people who still think this last one was rigged.
I don't know if you subscribe to this. I just heard for the first time today, but it makes a little sense with things I've heard you say before, that he might be very motivated the longer we go to run, because he might need the cover of the presidency
I have said that.
to shield himself.
No, I think that.
Yeah.
I do think that. I think he's got friends who need it, and I think he needs it as well. Yeah.
I saw a joke, a spoof that said his campaign slogan could be Trump 2024, I can't do time.
And, so here we've got a system where right now there's a debate about whether or not Trump, he's not president. So after a presidency, can you indict, a former president? Well, for heaven's sake, if the evidence is there, do we really believe no one is above the law?
That question was asked, wasn't it? Did you see that? Who's the gentleman in charge of Department of Justice?
Oh yeah, Merrick Garland.
And that's who it was. And he was asked, and he kind of laughed and said, I said no one is above the law. No one, yeah.
So they are looking into it, and, we'll see what that means for Trump. So people on January 6th, they come for a protest, but some of them came armed. Now, here's the January 6th committee showed this, and none of us knew it. We already knew because there was a video of guys at a hotel, a Comfort Inn, just outside the Capitol, around that area. And there's this video footage of them wheeling in cases full of guns and ammo. So we knew some people around the Capitol had guns.
Yeah, was that circumstantial? They're not. You haven't put them at the scene.
Right? So during the January 6th testimony, this gal Cassidy Hutchinson, who gives this explosive testimony, and she's right there in the White House, right there in the West Wing. And she says that there was this big discussion right before Trump gives his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th, and Trump is looking at monitors, and he's seeing that the crowd doesn't look as big as he would expect it to be, that right around where he's going to be speaking. And he says, why aren't these people coming up front? Why aren't there more of them? They said, well, they're having to go through the magnetometers. I think I pronounced it. They call them the mags. And that's just to detect, any weapons or anything.
Metal
right?
detectors.
The metal detectors. Yeah. So he says, get rid of the mags. And what was happening was, the reason you didn't have that many people is because these people had weapons. And so what was happening was they didn't want to go through the mags. So they hung outside the area where the metal detectors were so that they wouldn't have to give up their weapons. Some people did go through and gave up their weapons, but other people didn't. And he's told these people have weapons. That's why they're not going through. That is really, to me, crucial information that the President of the United States knew that large numbers of people had weapons on them when he gave his speech, which puts comments in the speech now in, like, you need to, and I'm just quoting what he said, you need to fight like hell. We're going to march on the Capitol. It puts all of that, to me, in a new light, that he knew that these people were armed right there. These aren't just cases of things at the Comfort Inn on the periphery. And he wanted to go with them. Remember, there was testimony about a confrontation with the Secret Service and the limo and all. And the Secret Service has destroyed texts of January 5th and 6th. And so now there's an investigation trying to get that.
I'll tell you, I've been just in the back of my mind, I hear some of those things before some of this has come out, and it's easy for me to chalk up some of the stuff he's done to incompetence, honestly. But then you hear something like that, and there is forethought and knowledge and evil intent in there that, here's an armed crowd, and he still sends them.
Yes, exactly. And says he's going to go with them. And then this was new from the January 6th committee. We didn't know that he really did say, hey, drive me to the Capitol. I'm going to the Capitol. I didn't know that. I thought he just sent them and then he went to watch it. That isn't what ended up happening, but apparently against his will. So here's the Secret Service now destroying texts. We'll see what comes of that. Then the question is, what is Trump doing during those hours of the attack going on? Well, this last hearing this week during prime time was all about those 3 hours. So perhaps we need to continue next week.
Okay. All right. Well, again, the reason that we talk about this is it's tied into our mission, how we interact with our neighbors and how we comport ourselves when these issues come up affects our mission and our credibility, and how we pray about it and the outcome of it could affect the way we go about carrying out our mission. And because of the breakdown of orderliness and law and things like we said. So that's why it's relevant. I hope that this has been helpful to you. If you're like me and you don't have the time or the desire to watch the things at length, a summary like this can be really helpful. So Pastor Ken, thank you for your perspective and the information. And we produce these episodes every week. We release them on Saturdays at 2. We hope that you subscribe to our channel. And if you don't, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you know when our new episodes come out. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.